June 19, 1944. Just before dawn, the Philippine Sea was a flat, black sheet, broken only by the white wakes of ships running hard to the west. On the flag bridge of a U.S. carrier, the air smelled of salt, hot paint, and coffee gone stale on a steel tray. Down below, in a compartment with no windows, a young radar operator named Collins watched a thin green line sweep around a circular screen. Every full rotation took a few seconds. Every rotation pushed the war a little closer. The scope had been mostly clear all night. A few rain showers, the occasional flicker that turned out to be nothing. Now, as the first gray of morning seeped under the blackout curtains, something new began to form on the glass. Small, faint echoes, strung along an arc far out on the edge of the range rings, like dust on a lens. He blinked, leaned closer, and watched them repeat on the next sweep. Not dust, targets. He read off bearing and range, voice flat, pen tapping against his message pad. At the plotting table, a lieutenant turned the numbers into small pencil marks on a sheet of waxed paper and felt his mouth go dry. The marks formed a line, and that line pointed straight at the carrier group. Contact. Far out. Many bogies. The ship around them did not look like anything impossible. It felt familiar. The steady tremor of turbines through the deck, the dull clank of watertight hatches opening and closing, the thud of boots on ladders. Up topside, the wind carried the smell of aviation gasoline and hydraulic fluid as deck crews began to move aircraft into position. Men stretched, yawned, finished cigarettes, adjusted helmets, shrugged into parachute harnesses. Routine, practiced 100 times in training, but on the plotting sheet in the Combat Information Center, the routine world was giving way to something else. Each sweep of the radar added more pencil marks, marching in. Far to the west, beyond that circle of green glass, the flight deck of the Japanese carrier Shokaku was already alive with motion. Floodlights washed the steel in hard white as crews pushed aircraft into their spots. The night air was thick with exhaust and shouted orders. A line of A-6mm fighters and D-4Y dive bombers sat in sequence, noses pointed at the bow, wings trembling as engines coughed and then settled into a rising growl. Petty Officer First Class. Tanaka tightened the strap on his Mae West and checked the instrument panel for the fourth time. Fuel, oil, manifold pressure. The needles were where they were supposed to be, but his hands would not stop sweating inside his gloves. He had been told since flight school that this is what the Imperial Navy existed for. This moment, this sortie, the decisive battle. The Americans were out there with their big, clumsy ships and their mass-produced aircraft. Japan did not need as many. It needed better men. That was the promise. The reality sat to his left and right in a row of cockpits. Some of the faces were boys' faces, sharper and thinner than the men who had flown at Pearl Harbor. Many of them had never seen combat. Fuel shortages had cut their training hours. Time had cut their instructors. They had memorized procedures in classrooms and pulled practice turns over empty sea, but very few had flown through flak or faced a swarm of enemy fighters. Tanaka was one of the older ones now, with maybe 200 hours in type, a few missions over the Solomons, a memory of a night landing in crosswind that still woke him up sweating. He looked down the deck, past the rising heat, to where the bow cut the darkness and the horizon waited, the place where the enemy fleet was supposed to be. He could not see it. He had never seen it. All he had were briefings, arrows on a chart, and the voice of a staff officer explaining that this time, if they struck hard and together, they could stop the Americans from taking the Marianas. Behind him, a deck officer raised a signal wand. The ship turned into the wind. The whole world pivoted around the idea that what they were about to do could change the course of the war. On the American carrier, Collins listened to the numbers climb. Range 150, group strength, estimate 50 plus. The lieutenant repeated the figure without inflection, though he knew exactly what it meant. 50 aircraft was not a raid. It was a wave, and there were more echoes forming behind it, weaker but multiplying. A second wave, maybe a third. The pencil marks on the plot began to resemble the weather maps he had seen in school. Fronts, bands, concentrations. In the ready room, one deck up, Hellcat pilots sat on metal chairs, helmets on their knees, staring at a blackboard where someone had drawn a crude outline of the task force and arcs of expected approach. The fans overhead pushed warm air and the faint smell of nervous sweat. They were not new to war. Many of them had flown over the Marshalls and the Gilberts, had bounced zeros off atolls whose names blurred together. They trusted their aircraft. The F-6F had thick armor around the cockpit, self-sealing tanks, a big, steady engine that would take punishment and keep turning. It could outdive a Zero, match it in a climb, and absorb hits that would have turned earlier fighters into scrap. They knew that. They also knew what it meant to be above open water when tracers started coming up in thin, bright strings. A buzzer sounded. The room came alive in an instant. Chairs scraping, men standing, straps picked up from the floor. The squadron commander gave them the same words he always did. Nothing inspirational, just reminders about altitudes, formations, radio discipline. It should have sounded routine. It did not feel routine. Outside, the first Hellcat was already on the catapult, tail hooked, engine at full power, the whole airframe trembling with contained force. The wind over the bow smelled of the tropics and hot metal. Down the deck, bombers sat with folding wings extended, waiting for their turn later. For a moment, as the pilot looked straight ahead at the dark smear of the horizon, it was possible to believe this was just another intercept, another raid, another day. Then the carrier's air defense officer walked into CIC, looked at the growing plot, and understood that something about this attack was different. The contacts were too many, the spacing was too regular, the range was still long. They were seeing the strike force long before any human eye could have picked it out of the sky. That was the impossible part. If you had grown up on stories of naval combat, where ships only saw each other at the limit of visibility, where pilots hunted one another by instinct and luck. Here, inside a steel box lit by red lamps, men were watching a battle form 150 miles away. Radar had been on these ships for years now. They had tested it, trained on it, used it at night. But even the officers who trusted it most were not entirely used to what it meant in a fight like this. To know, in detail, how many aircraft were coming, and from what direction, while the enemy still flew over empty sea toward a position he could only estimate. On Shokaku, Tanaka opened his throttle and felt the engine pull against the brakes. The deck officer swung his wand forward. Brakes off. The fighter leapt ahead, tail lifting, engine roar folding the rest of the world into a single, physical sound that he felt in his chest. The carrier's deck raced under him. The bow came up. For a moment, there was nothing under his wheels but air and spray. Then the fighter bit into the wind and climbed. He joined the circling pattern, found his place in the formation, checked the position of his wingman. Below, the carrier shrank, a small rectangle of light and motion in the blue-black surface. Ahead, the east was beginning to pale through layered clouds. He settled into his harness, checked fuel again, and forced himself to slow his breathing. Everywhere he looked, there were friendly aircraft, wings glinting, engines shimmering in the growing light. It felt, briefly, like strength, like they were not alone in the sky, like sheer numbers might carry them through whatever waited beyond the horizon. Tanaka did not know that the same numbers, seen from the other side of the ocean on a sheet of waxed paper, already looked like a problem that had only one logical outcome. On the American carrier, Collins watched the range ticks count down as the intercept vectors went out to the fighters. 130 miles, 120. The Hellcats clawed for altitude, heavy with fuel, their wingtips leaving thin white scars across the morning sky. Somewhere above 10,000 feet, the air turned cooler. engines sounded slightly different in the pilot's ears. They spread into a wide screen ahead of the fleet, guided not by what their eyes could see, but by bearings read off from a man in a dark room staring at a circle of green light. The ocean below looked empty. The storm above it did not. In Tokyo, staff officers had once drawn a decisive battle as two neat sets of arrows converging from opposite sides of a map. In the Philippine Sea, the first real convergence of that day was about to happen in 3 dimensions. At closing speeds, no one in those warm offices had ever felt. From the Japanese cockpits, the sky still seemed open, endless, theirs to cross. From the American plot, it already looked crowded. So crowded that the men behind the grease pencils had trouble keeping up with all the marks. There was nothing yet to suggest that by late afternoon, more than 350 of those marks would disappear. To the men strapped into thin-skinned aircraft over deep water, that possibility belonged to another world entirely. They flew toward each other in clean formations, inside engines they trusted and doctrines they believed in, toward an encounter that, by every measure they had grown up with, should not be as one-sided as it was about to become. In the years before the war, the map in the Naval General Staff building in Tokyo told a simple story. The Pacific was wide, but not infinite. The home islands sat at one edge, the American west coast at the other. Between them, islands and archipelagos dotted the blue. Each pin on the wall, Formosa, the Marshalls, the Carolines, the Marianas, stood for an airfield, a refueling point, a submarine base. The officers who studied that map believed they understood how war would unfold across it. They had a theory. They called it decisive battle. The logic was straightforward. Japan could never match the United States in raw industry. Everyone in uniform knew it. They had seen the figures: American steel production, automotive output, shipbuilding tonnage. In a long war of attrition on equal terms, the country that made more would crush the one that made less. So the war must not be allowed to become a long war of attrition on equal terms. The Navy's answer was to win quickly and sharply. They would strike at the beginning, cripple the American Pacific Fleet, seize a wide defensive perimeter, then wait. As the United States pushed west to recover lost ground, Japanese submarines and land-based aircraft would wear down each move. Convoys would be hit, advance bases isolated, outlying task forces nipped and cut. When the Americans finally reached the inner ring somewhere between the Philippines and the Marianas, their fleet would be tired and thin. Then, and only then, the combined fleet would come out in force. In a single, massive action, carrier against carrier, battleship against battleship, Japan would seek the one great victory that would break American will and force a negotiation. Every staff exercise, every plan, bent back toward that image. 2 fleets closing in clear water, guns firing over open horizons, while carrier aircraft rose and fell like a tide. Underpinning that image was something more than geometry and fuel calculations. It was a belief about people. The men who lectured at the Naval War College and the staff schools spoke openly about it. Japan, they said, had a martial spirit that the West did not. Its officers came from a tradition of samurai discipline. Its sailors and pilots accepted hardship as a duty. The United States, by contrast, was described as a country of merchants, technically clever, materially rich, but soft at the edges. If Japan could narrow the material gap through careful strategy and interruptions of American logistics, that difference in spirit and training would decide the rest. The air arm of the Navy fit neatly into this thinking. Carrier aviators were chosen from the best students, put through a brutal program that washed out most and hardened the remainder. In the late 1930s, a Japanese naval pilot might log several hundred hours before joining a frontline unit. Those who flew in China gained still more experience over real targets under real fire. They developed tactics that took full advantage of their strengths. The Zero fighter was light, long-legged, and agile. Dive bombers and torpedo planes were drilled to attack in coordinated waves. Exercises were flown with tight discipline. Those who did poorly were told, very directly, that they had failed. Those who excelled came to see themselves, with some justification, as the finest naval airmen in the world. When the war opened at Pearl Harbor, and then spread into the Western Pacific, each success seemed to confirm the theory. At Pearl, they had flown hundreds of miles over open ocean, struck precisely, and returned with minimal losses. In the Indian Ocean, they had embarrassed the Royal Navy. Off the Philippines and in the East Indies, they had destroyed older American and British battleships that tried to stand in their way. Each engagement fed the narrative. Superior training and spirit could overturn differences in tonnage and factory output. Inside this framework, Midway and the Solomons were not understood as warnings. They were filed as exceptions. Midway's disaster, the loss of 4 carriers and many of their best aircrews, was explained in post-battle discussions as a matter of chance, code leaks, and a few errors in judgment. Painful, yes, but not evidence that the whole theory of decisive battle was flawed. In the Solomons, the grinding attrition was blamed on terrain, illness, and the difficulty of sustaining operations at the end of a long supply line. Reports from the front came up through a chain that filtered and softened. Commanders in the field did not always admit the full extent of their losses, especially in pilots. Public communiques spoke of hard fighting, of enemy casualties, of damage inflicted. No one issued a bulletin announcing that the core of the pre-war aviator corps was being bled away one mission at a time. Inside the headquarters, on paper, air groups were still listed at theoretical strength. Replacement units were marked as forming or training. A chart might show a carrier with a projected complement of so many fighters, so many dive bombers, so many torpedo planes by a certain date. The question of who would fly them, and with what experience, did not always appear in the same neat lines. Fuel shortages crept into the system like rust. Japan's limited oil reserves and submarine losses in the South Pacific meant aviation fuel had to be rationed. Training flights were cut back. Students flew fewer hours. Where a pre-war trainee might have practiced landings and formation work until the motions were sunk deep into muscle memory, wartime trainees learned the same skills with less time in the air. With each year, the gap between what doctrine demanded and what units could deliver grew wider. Yet the documents produced in Tokyo still spoke the language of pre-war confidence. In the spring of 1944, as American forces moved through the Central Pacific, planning staffs considered the next moves. The Marianas loomed large. Intelligence suggested the enemy was preparing to threaten Saipan. Analysts understood that if the Americans seized those islands, they could base 4-engine bombers there, capable of reaching the home islands. That prospect elevated the campaign from important to critical. The orders that summoned Ozawa's first mobile fleet to sea bore the weight of that urgency. They also bore the imprint of the old worldview. The plan assumed that Japan could still concentrate enough air power, carrier-based and land-based, to strike the American fleet with a blow heavy enough to halt, or at least interrupt the invasion. It assumed that most of those aircraft would reach their targets. It assumed, finally, that the fighting quality of Japanese aviators would allow them to do more damage per sortie than their American counterparts. In thick briefing books, these assumptions appeared as tables and timelines. Land bases on Guam, Rota, and other fields were assigned roles. Carriers would launch waves that would be reinforced by shore-based squadrons. Combined attacks would overwhelm American defenses. After the initial engagement, surviving units would rearm and refuel, then strike again. The officers reading those pages knew the losses of the past. Many had served in staff positions during the long months around Guadalcanal. They had watched report after report come in: missing pilots, aircraft destroyed, airfields evacuated. But in the controlled environment of a planning room, it was possible to treat those losses as temporary setbacks instead of structural shifts. The belief that Japanese quality could compensate for Japanese scarcity did not vanish with Midway. It hardened. In briefings to senior commanders, intelligence officers described the American Navy as heavily reinforced but bound by its own limitations. They discussed the number of carriers, the types of aircraft observed, the arrangement of task forces. They acknowledged that the enemy had improved radar and fighter control, but the details of how those systems worked in practice were often vague. No Japanese officer had sat behind an American radar scope in combat. They had not stood in a combat information center watching fighters nudged into place over the horizon. They did, however, have their own radar sets on some ships and on a few islands. Those sets were newer, fewer, and less fully integrated into doctrine. In some commands, they were viewed as useful adjuncts to watchkeeping, not as the nervous system of an entire fleet. Where information was incomplete, habit filled the gaps. Staff attitudes toward American pilots had been formed in the early months of the war, when many U.S. aviators were relatively inexperienced and flew older types. Those attitudes were slow to adjust to a new reality in which the United States was graduating thousands of aircrew a year and sending them forward in machines designed with the hard lessons of 1942 in mind. Japanese naval officers were not blind. They saw more American carriers in each engagement. They heard rumors about new factories on the West Coast turning out aircraft in astonishing numbers. Some had read translated reports on the enemy's training system and industrial mobilization, but the human mind protects itself. Faced with numbers that seemed impossible to counter, many officers fell back on what they understood: courage, discipline, and the memory of earlier victories. In squadron ready rooms from Truk to the Inland Sea, younger pilots listened to older men talk about Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean. Those stories were not lies. They were accurately told, down to the shape of bomb splashes and the way foreign ships had burned. The problem was that those stories belonged to a different war. By 1944, the average age and experience of Japanese naval aviators had shifted. Veterans of the early campaigns were dead, recovered ashore with wounds, or moved into training and staff roles. Their places in the cockpit were taken by men like Tanaka's newer wingmen, quick, serious, willing, but with far fewer hours. Instructors did what they could. They pushed students hard, flew them in close formation, drilled emergency procedures. They cut away anything they considered non-essential. Some nights, after long days over the training fields, they sat alone and did their own arithmetic. Hours per trainee, sorties available, fuel remaining. Those quiet calculations rarely made it into the official optimism of a staff briefing. On Guam, in the weeks before the American landings on Saipan, a base commander stood at the edge of a runway and watched a formation come in from a training flight. The approach was ragged. One aircraft bounced hard on landing, veered, corrected at the last moment. No one crashed. No one died. On paper, it counted as a successful exercise. He knew how his own class had flown at this stage of training, years before. He knew how many hours he had logged before being trusted with a complex operational mission. These young men would be asked to fly farther, in worse conditions, against a more capable enemy. But there was no time to ask for more months, more fuel, more training sorties. There were orders from Tokyo and Truk. There were dates on the calendar that could not be moved. In conference rooms aboard the flagships of the first mobile fleet, operations officers laid out the plan for what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea. They took the best numbers available: aircraft on carriers, aircraft at island bases, pilots nominally rated combat ready, and arranged them into waves and timings. They saw the gaps. They noted shortages of spare parts, the lack of seasoned navigators, the thin pool of instructors at home. Then they set those concerns aside. The decisive battle, they told themselves, was not a matter that could be postponed until conditions were perfect. The Americans were already off Saipan, If they did nothing, the Marianas would fall, and with them, perhaps, Japan's chance to control how the war ended. Faced with that prospect, the old belief regained its shape. Japanese skill, Japanese resolve, Japanese willingness to suffer would be asked once more to bridge the widening gap between doctrine and reality. On one of the planning charts, a staff officer drew a neat arrow from the approximate position of the first mobile fleet to a point east of the Marianas, where American carriers were believed to be. Along that arrow, he marked not just the expected track of Ozawa's ships, but the intended path of hundreds of aircraft that would lift from their decks at dawn and drive toward the enemy fleet. He paused a moment, pen hovering, thinking about what each of those small symbols represented. An aircraft type, a pilot, a level of training he could only infer from paper reports. Then he finished the line, capped the pen, and moved on to the next task. Somewhere behind him, in a drawer, lay a thinner folder. Raw data on pilot flight hours, accident rates, and the reduced training syllabus. It would not be brought out in the final briefing. In a Navy that had convinced itself for years that quality would beat quantity, the idea that quality itself might now be eroding was the one topic no one wanted to see laid bare on the table. On the morning of June 19th, as Tanaka's fighter climbed east over the Philippine Sea, that omission was nothing more than a quiet fact on a sheet of paper no one had time to read. Within a few hours, it would be written instead in fire and falling metal. The first sign that the Americans had built something different was not the number of ships on the horizon. It was the way a voice in a dark room could move fighters in the sky, as if they were pieces on an invisible board. Collins sat at his radar scope with the headset pressed tight against his ears and the grease pencil smudges on his fingertips. Around him, the Combat Information Center hummed with controlled noise, fans turning, paper rustling, the low murmur of men repeating bearings and ranges. The air was close and smelled of sweat and hot electronics. On his screen, the enemy strike was no longer a faint suggestion. It was a dense cluster of echoes, now at a range where, in another war, men would only just be looking up from the decks and seeing specks against the sun. He read out the latest numbers. The fighter director officer, Lieutenant Commander Harris, square-shouldered, hair already going thin at the temples, stood at the plotting table with a headset of his own and a calm he had earned in dozens of exercises. Red 1, Vector 080, Angels 20, Bogies bearing 120, range 70, closing fast. The pilot on the other end acknowledged, voice tight but steady. On the plotting sheet, the symbols for the Hellcat squadrons slid into position against the advancing band of enemy contacts. This was not improvisation. It was the result of a system that had been under construction since before Collins had ever seen a radar tube. It began years earlier, not at sea, but in classrooms in places like Seattle, Oklahoma City, and Jacksonville. There, men who would never see the Philippine Sea had stood in front of chalkboards and explained to young officers what it meant to fight a war scattered across thousands of miles, how information would be the only way to see beyond the curve of the earth. In one such classroom back in 1942, Harris had sat with a notebook open while an instructor drew a circle on the board and labeled it CIC. Around it, he sketched arcs labeled radar, radio, lookouts, and gunnery. The point, repeated until it sank in, was simple. The ship could no longer be commanded only from the bridge by a captain looking out past his binoculars. The ship needed a brain in its center, a place where every piece of data flowed, was weighed, and then turned into orders. The idea met resistance at first. Some senior officers were uncomfortable with the thought of relying on a room full of younger men watching instruments instead of the horizon. Others doubted the reliability of equipment still being refined, but the war had taught its own lessons. Night actions in Iron Bottom Sound, surprise raids, sudden appearances of enemy aircraft out of cloud banks. Each event underlined the same fact. Whoever could see farther, faster, and coordinate more precisely would live longer. Back in the United States, that idea turned into blueprints, training manuals, and new compartments carved into the guts of ships under construction. Shipyards along the coasts began laying out CICs as standard, running cables for radar sets, installing repeaters for gunnery, and fitting tables designed specifically for plotting air and surface tracks. The same pattern repeated in other parts of the system. When a design team at Grumman on Long Island received the contract for a new carrier fighter to replace the Wildcat, they did not think in romantic terms. They thought in weight, horsepower, and production runs. The engineers knew something that did not appear on Japanese staff maps. The United States had the industrial capacity to build a heavier, more powerful fighter and still deliver it to the fleet in numbers. They designed the F-6F Hellcat accordingly. It had a big Pratt & Whitney radial engine, thick wings that could hold ammunition and fuel, armor around the pilot, and systems arranged so that maintenance crews on carriers could reach and replace parts quickly. On the test fields behind the factory, pilots pushed the prototype into climbs and dives, while engineers watched from the ground with clipboards. Adjustments were made, skins thickened, control surfaces refined. The aircraft that emerged was not elegant in the way the Zero had been. It was solid and forgiving. It could take hits, keep flying, and bring its pilot back. Inside the factory, a different kind of planning took over. Production engineers laid out assembly lines so that each airframe moved in stages, past workers who repeated the same tasks until their motions were as sure as a pilot's in a cockpit. Women with hair tied back under scarves riveted skins, installed wiring harnesses, and checked fasteners with trained fingertips. Crates of identical parts arrived on a schedule from suppliers who had been told exactly how many bolts, bearings, and castings would be needed each week. In a quiet office overlooking the line, a man with a slide rule and a stack of paper had done the basic arithmetic. If each station completed its work in a given number of minutes, if shifts ran around the clock, the plant could deliver a finished Hellcat every few hours. Scale that output across multiple factories, and the Navy would not have to choose between sending fighters to the Pacific or to training commands. It could do both. That training system was its own machine. In the middle of Oklahoma, on flat land carved into rectangles by roads and runways, cadets climbed into training aircraft painted in bright colors. Instructors who had flown in earlier campaigns took them into the air and drilled them in basic maneuvers until they could keep formation without thinking about it. Then they moved on to instrument work, navigation, gunnery, and carrier landings practiced on painted outlines of decks. The syllabus had been hammered into shape by experience. Early in the war, cadets had washed out at high rates. Some had arrived at frontline squadrons with uneven skills. Each failure was examined. Each gap in training was addressed with new exercises, better simulators, more standardized evaluations. The result was not brilliance, but consistency. A pilot like Collins's friend Daniels, who now sat in a Hellcat cockpit over the Philippine Sea with his thumb resting lightly on the radio trigger, had not been chosen because he was 1 in 1,000. He was one of tens of thousands processed through a system designed to produce reliability. He had gone from a civilian life in Ohio into a pipeline that touched dozens of people and places, a recruiter's office, an induction center, basic training, multiple flight schools, a gunnery range, a carrier qualification course, advanced training with a squadron, and finally the long trip across the Pacific to join Task Force 58. Along the way, every instructor had filled out forms, graded performance, and passed those numbers up. If Daniels had struggled badly, the system would have caught it. If he had excelled, it would have noted that too. In the end, he arrived at the fleet as one more competent pilot among many, not irreplaceable, but good enough to do the job asked of him. Behind him, handling the aircraft that would carry him into combat and hopefully back, A crew of mechanics on his carrier had their own system. Overnight, while he slept in a narrow bunk under the dull thrum of the ship's engines, plane captains had checked plugs, topped off oil, inspected tires, and tested gun feeds. They worked by feel as much as sight, running hands over panels to detect loose fasteners. Parts that showed wear were replaced before they failed. Spare engines sat in the hangar decks, preserved in grease and paper, ready to be hoisted into place. Ammunition stores were organized by caliber and load, ready for crews who knew exactly how many rounds each gun would fire in a typical engagement. None of this was dramatic. All of it added up. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, staff officers had worried not just about single battles, but about replacement cycles. How many aircraft were likely to be lost each month? How many pilots might be killed or rotated? How many trained men and machines would be needed to keep units at strength? On wall charts and in ledgers, they tracked output from factories, graduation rates from flight schools, shipping schedules from the West Coast. If a gap appeared, a shortage of a particular type, a bottleneck in a component, they pushed back into the system and changed something. A contract was increased. A plant was retooled. A training syllabus was adjusted. By the summer of 1944, that invisible structure stretched from machine shops in Buffalo to the wind-whipped decks now turning into the wind in the Philippine Sea. In the Combat Information Center, Harris did not think about any of this explicitly as he gave his next set of vectors. He thought about closure speeds, altitudes, and the need to keep his fighters between the enemy and the fleet. Blue 2, come right to 120, Angels 18. You'll be on top of them in 2 minutes. Watch your fuel. On his plot, the symbols representing Japanese aircraft were still just marks, but he knew enough to picture what they represented. Mixed formations, some pilots seasoned, many more young, all of them flying without the benefit of any picture beyond what their own eyes could see. He had read intelligence reports about Japanese training. He knew that flight hours had gone down. He also knew that the Zero, for all its agility, lacked armor and self-sealing tanks. In the closed air of CIC, these were facts, not boasts. They were input into a calculation whose output would determine how many bombs fell toward the ships below and how many did not. Out over the ocean, Daniels craned his neck inside the Hellcat canopy, eyes scanning the pale blue ahead. The radio crackled with Harris's voice, then the short affirmations of his squadron leader. He did not see the enemy yet. But the vector made sense. The bearing matched what they had been told in briefings about likely Japanese approach routes. He trusted that the man somewhere below, reading the instruments, was putting them where they needed to be. That trust was its own resource, a product of doctrine and repetition. Carrier air groups in the Pacific had run interception drills countless times, sometimes chasing nothing but phantoms, sometimes turning back small raiders. The procedure was familiar. Climb to assigned altitude, spread out to cover the sector, hold formation, wait for the first sighting. A few moments later, the shout came over the radio. "Tally-ho! Bandits, 11 o'clock high, maybe 20, 25 of them." Daniels saw them seconds after. A loose, scattered formation against the morning sky, dark specks growing into recognizable shapes. Even at a distance, the contrast was visible. The Japanese formation was stretched, some aircraft flying slightly out of place, altitudes uneven. Their line had frayed over the long distance out from their carriers. There had been no guiding hand on a radar screen to tighten it back up. The American fighters, by contrast, turned together, line abreast, then fanned into sections as they dove. Years of training flights over stateside fields and months of combat experience in other campaigns now paid out in instinctive moves. Check 6, pick a target, keep your wingman in sight. From below, on the carrier, the first signs that contact had been made came not from the sky, but from the plot. The tight band of echoes that had been driving toward the fleet began to break up. Some turned away. Others slowed. "Looks like they've tangled," Collins said quietly, half to himself. Harris watched the changes and shifted his attention to the next wave behind the first. The system never focused on just one duel. It treated the entire airspace as a problem to be managed. In the skies above, the Hellcat's strengths, speed in a dive, ruggedness, heavy armament, showed themselves in ways that Japanese planners at their distant tables had not fully accounted for. A Zero could still outturn a Hellcat at low speed, but the American pilots had been taught not to play that game. They came in from above, fired long bursts from 6.50 caliber guns, then climbed back up into the sun. When Japanese fighters scored hits in return, rounds often punched through armor or thick wing skins without reaching fuel or flesh. Those aircraft that took damage but remained flyable turned back toward the carriers, or, failing that, toward the general direction of Guam, trusting that there would be some place to land. Behind the lines of individual combat, the larger pattern became clear. Each time an enemy wave appeared on Collins's scope, Harris sent a corresponding wave of fighters to meet it well before it reached the critical zone over the ships. Some attackers slipped through. None came in at full strength. The closer they got, the more fragmented and exhausted they became. On Guam, Japanese ground controllers listened for returning formations that never checked in. They looked at strips of paper recording takeoffs, each marked with call signs, and waited for the matching landings. The quiet between transmissions grew longer. On Ozawa's flagship, the reports began to arrive by signal lamp and wireless. First one missed rendezvous, then another. Pilots who did return spoke in strained voices about swarms of enemy fighters appearing out of nowhere, diving from heights they had not expected the Americans to reach so quickly. They mentioned something else, too, something that lodged uneasily in the minds of the more technically minded officers. The way the enemy seemed to know where they were going to be. It would have been easy to dismiss those impressions as the fog of combat. In another war, at another time, that is what might have happened. But the pattern repeated with each wave. Carefully timed strikes arrived over patches of empty sea where the Americans were supposed to be, then ran into interceptions that felt less like chance encounters and more like ambushes laid at long range. On the decks of the U.S. carriers, crewmen who were not needed at their stations slipped outside between alarms and looked up. What they saw was not a chaotic free-for-all, but something like a grim routine. Fighters launching, fighters landing, damaged aircraft limping in with holes in their wings, crash crews standing ready. In the hangars below, mechanics glanced at bullet holes and shrapnel scars and knew what they meant. An aircraft that could come home in that condition was an aircraft designed by men who had expected it to be hit. The realization that day was not that the Americans were braver than their opponents. It was that bravery had been built into a larger framework. The radar operators, the fighter directors, the factory workers, the training instructors, the logistical officers who scheduled convoys and calculated ammunition consumption, all of them, scattered across continents and ships, had been assembled into a machine whose output was visible now in the gaps opening in Japanese formations and the growing number of enemy aircraft falling from the sky without ever sighting a carrier. Somewhere between the first contact on Collins's scope and the late afternoon reports reaching Ozawa's flag bridge, the balance that Japanese planners had believed they could redress with one decisive battle quietly disappeared. It did not vanish in a single explosion or a dramatic exchange of gunfire. It was ground away in the arithmetic of sorties, the speed of information, the reliability of engines that started when asked, and guns that fired when triggered. As the sun climbed higher over the Philippine Sea and the water turned a brighter blue, the men inside the American system could not yet see the full shape of what they had done. They saw only the next vector, the next wave, the next fuel state to check. The revelation of what that system meant would arrive first, not with triumph, but with a series of questions on the other side of the battle. Questions asked in low voices in Japanese ready rooms that were filling more slowly after each launch. By late afternoon, the Philippine Sea looked almost peaceful. From the flag bridge of Ozawa's flagship, the ocean was a hard blue plate, broken only by the fleet's own wakes. The roar and smoke of launches had faded. The flight decks, once crowded, were strangely clear. Spot crews waiting for aircraft that were late, then very late, then simply not coming back. Inside the flag plot, the air was thick and hot. A long table held a chart of the surrounding sea. Small markers showed the reported positions of American forces, the tracks of Ozawa's own task groups, the approximate locations of Guam and the other island bases. At the edge of the table, a communications officer laid down another flimsy message sheet with the careful neutrality of a man setting down a scalpel. "From Guam Air Command, sir." The chief of staff picked it up. His finger followed the lines, lips moving silently. Sorties flown, aircraft returned, pilots missing. He read it twice, then handed it to Ozawa without comment. The admiral took it, glasses low on his nose. The motion of the ship made the light from the shaded lamp sway across the thin paper. He had received battle reports before: damaged ships, lost aircraft, units that had performed well or poorly. The format was familiar. Only the ratios were new. He looked at the numbers for a long moment. 3 out of 32, the chief of staff said quietly. Another wave. 5 out of 26. They both knew that missing in this context did not mean lost in cloud or diverted to alternate landing grounds. It meant pilots shot down over open sea or mortally wounded. Men who had taken years to train, who could not be replaced by any quick order. On Shokaku, where Tanaka had launched that morning, the reality arrived in a different form. The ship rolled very slightly as she cut through the swells. Her crew moved with the practiced adjustments of men long used to the motion. The hangar deck, designed to hold dozens of aircraft in close ranks, felt strangely hollow. A maintenance petty officer walked the length of the space, past tied-down fuel lines and stacked bomb trolleys. His eyes traced the outlines where aircraft should have been parked between safety chains. All he saw were stains on the deck and the squared-off shapes of deck markings. He stopped by a tool cart and rested one hand on its edge. It was a small gesture, but his knuckles were white. A pilot's locker room, 2 decks up, told the same story more plainly. Helmets and flight jackets hung in rows. Some hooks were empty. Others held gear that would not be used again. Tanaka's wingman's helmet still sat on a bench where he had set it for a moment before launch. No one had touched it. The name stenciled on the back seemed suddenly too clean. The paint too new. The few pilots who had made it back sat on the edge of their bunks or lay on their backs staring at the overhead, still wearing half-unzipped flight suits. Their faces were gray with fatigue and something harder to name. In the debrief, they had tried to describe what they had seen. Enemy fighters appearing at just the right altitude, from just the right direction, as if someone had drawn a line through the sky and put them there. "We turned toward the fleet," one had said, his voice hoarse. "They were already between us and the sun. The first warning we had was tracers." The intelligence officer had taken notes, asking about aircraft types, markings, tactics. It was his job to extract useful patterns from individual impressions. What lodged in his mind was not any one detail, but the consistency. Intercepted at long range, again and again, before reaching weapons release. Formations broken before they could descend into the familiar pattern of torpedo runs and dive bombing. When he reported his findings to the operations staff, the reaction was almost physical. Men shifted in their chairs, crossed arms, frowned. No one said the word radar, but it hung there in the air, heavier than the cigarette smoke. On the flagship that evening, Ozawa convened a conference in the wardroom. The room was cramped, bulkheads sweated moisture, and the smell of diesel and cooking oil lingered under the sharper odor of tobacco. Officers stood around a central table, some still in life jackets and sidearms, others in shirt sleeves with rolled-up maps under their arms. The chief of staff reviewed the air operations for the day. He spoke in a flat, controlled tone, but each figure landed with the weight of a dropped shell. First wave, contact with enemy fighters at long range. Attack on enemy carriers unconfirmed. Losses heavy. Second wave, Similar pattern. Reports of intense fighter opposition. Minimal reports of bombs on target. Third wave. His voice trailed off for a heartbeat. Third wave did not reach plotted attack point. Assume interception prior. Someone asked about land-based support from Guam. Also engaged by enemy fighters before reaching target area, the chief replied. Radio traffic indicates considerable confusion. Some pilots diverted to alternate fields. Many never reported in. The room was silent for a moment, broken only by the creak of the ship's structure and the faint sound of ventilation fans. A gunnery officer cleared his throat. Admiral, it seems clear the Americans have very strong fighter cover. But tomorrow, if we close... Close with what? Another officer snapped, then caught himself and lowered his voice. We have lost. How many carrier aircraft today alone? Figures were read off from a notepad. The number was not exact. Some squadrons had not yet reported. Some aircraft might yet limp back. But even with generous assumptions, the losses were catastrophic. The room absorbed it without exclamation. These were not men given to displays. Instead, shoulders straightened, jaws clenched, eyes went to the chart as if it might offer an escape. Ozawa looked around the table. He was a slight man, carefully composed, with a calm that came from habit and training. He had been given command of the mobile fleet, knowing that his ships and air groups were not what they had been in 1941. His duty was to make the best use of what remained. What we have seen today, he said slowly, is not simply enemy strength. It is a different manner of fighting. He tapped the edge of the chart with one finger. They knew our approach bearings. They met us far from their main body. Our pilots report coordinated interceptions at multiple altitudes. He paused. We expected heavy opposition. We did not expect our strikes to be broken up before they could deliver any meaningful blow. Someone murmured that perhaps the Americans had been lucky. Another mentioned clouds, misnavigation, the fatigue of young pilots. Ozawa listened, but his eyes stayed on the map. He had seen luck before. This did not feel like luck. It felt like a wall, an invisible surface his air groups had flown into at speed. In that cramped wardroom, the theory of decisive battle, carefully built over decades, began to dissolve, not in argument, but in a series of small realizations that no one wanted to speak aloud. If they could not push strike aircraft through that wall of fighters directed by unseen hands, if their pilots were being consumed faster than they could be trained, if each attempt to treat the Americans as they had been in 1941 resulted instead in one-sided slaughter, then there was no battle to be won in the way they had imagined. There was only a process of being defeated, piece by piece. Late that night, after the conference broke up, the communications officer brought Ozawa a message from Combined Fleet Headquarters. It inquired about the day's operations and asked for prospects for the next. The admiral read it at his small desk in his sea cabin, the lamp burning low, the ship's motion steady beneath him. He thought about how to answer. He could report in the terms his superiors expected. Strong enemy resistance, serious but not irreparable losses, intention to renew the attack. Those were phrases the system knew how to digest. Instead, he picked up his pen and, after a long pause, wrote a line that was as close to a confession as any active commander could send. Enemy carrier air power and fighter direction far exceed expectations. Our ability to inflict decisive damage under present conditions is doubtful. The words were careful, but the meaning under them was not. On Guam, the base commander walked the line of dispersal revetments by flashlight. The night was warm and still. Insects buzzed. The concrete under his boots held the day's heat. Here and there, a mechanic worked by the light of a hooded lantern, coaxing life back into an engine or patching a wing. Most of the revetments were empty. He stopped at one and stood for a while, listening to the quiet. In his memory, he saw the sky as it had been described by the few pilots who had returned, filled not with targets, but with enemy fighters. He thought of the training fields back home, the schedules, the fuel allotments, The check rides cut short because there was no more gasoline. For years, he had believed that those compromises could be made up for. In battle, by will and discipline. Tonight, staring at the bare concrete where aircraft should have sat, he felt that belief slip, like sand under his heel. No speech marked the moment. No document circulated announcing the end of an idea. Reality arrived instead, as empty hooks, silent radios, unclaimed helmets, and a line in a dispatch that admitted, in measured language, that the war in the air had moved beyond anything Japan's Navy had prepared itself to fight. In the end, the battle over the Philippine Sea can be reduced to a series of ratios. The first is simple: aircraft lost. On June 19, 1944, the Japanese Navy and its supporting land-based units sent several hundred aircraft toward the American fleet. By the time the day ended, more than 350 of those airplanes were gone. Many never reached weapons release. A significant number were shot down, without ever sighting a single U.S. ship. American losses in the air were measured in dozens, not hundreds. Of those, a large fraction were not destroyed in combat, but lost to fuel exhaustion or landing accidents after long-range strikes and night recoveries. The kill ratio in the sky that day ran roughly 5 or 6 to 1 in the Americans' favor, even before counting aircraft destroyed on the ground or on sinking carriers. Over the course of the whole Battle of the Philippine Sea, the ratio climbs higher. Behind those numbers stood deeper ones. In 1944, the United States was producing combat aircraft at a rate Japan could not approach. American factories turned out more than 90,000 aircraft that year, of all types. Japan's total output hovered at a fraction of that. For carrier fighters specifically, Grumman's lines were capable of delivering Hellcats at a pace that, in practical terms, meant a lost fighter could be replaced in weeks. Japanese carrier-capable aircraft depended on smaller, more vulnerable industrial bases, with tighter bottlenecks in engines and specialized components. Pilot production told the same story in different units. Before the war, a Japanese naval aviator might log 500 to 800 hours before reaching a frontline unit. By 1944, fuel shortages and time pressure had cut that down sharply. New pilots were arriving at carriers with perhaps a couple of hundred hours total, much of it in trainers, with limited experience in instrument flying or formation work over open ocean. American naval aviators, fed through a standardized pipeline, typically reported to operational squadrons with 250 to 300 flight hours and a more even distribution of skills. The difference was not in the total number alone, but in how those hours were structured. Instrument time, simulated carrier operations, gunnery practice under controlled conditions, and a progression of checks that weeded out the worst performers. A Japanese training command struggling with fuel allocations might cancel a day's flights and move students into classrooms. An American training command, supplied by a domestic oil industry and protected shipping lanes, could keep aircraft in the air day after day. Fuel itself was a decisive column on the ledger. Japan, dependent on imported oil from Southeast Asia, saw its supply lines steadily constricted by American submarines and aircraft. Every barrel of aviation fuel had to be argued over. Training, operations, reserve. By 1944, there was never enough. The United States, drawing on domestic oil and a secure continental base, did not have to choose between training and operations in the same way. It could do both at scale. Logistics extended the gap. A U.S. fast carrier task force at sea was accompanied by oilers, ammunition ships, and logistics support, capable of refueling and rearming in blue water. That ability allowed Task Force 58 to maintain a high sortie rate over multiple days. Aircraft could be turned around quickly because spare parts were in the storerooms, and men trained to install them were already on board. Japanese carriers often operated closer to land bases, but lacked equivalent underway replenishment capacity. They had fewer spare engines, fewer standardized parts, and fewer experienced maintenance personnel per aircraft. An airframe that came back damaged to an American carrier might be repaired overnight. The same level of damage on a Japanese deck might mean cannibalization or abandonment. Information moved along different curves as well. American radar sets, integrated into a doctrine of fighter direction, extended the effective defensive radius of the fleet by more than 100 miles. Detection at long range allowed for tiered interceptions, first contact by high-altitude fighters, then secondary groups if leakers broke through. Japan had radar in limited quantities, but not woven as tightly into operations. There was no equivalent network that could see an incoming raid at that distance and then systematically feed its position and height to interceptors. Japanese strike groups flew long over-water legs, navigated by dead reckoning and scattered radio reports. American fighters flew under constant guidance from controllers, who saw the entire engagement as a moving diagram. The geometry of the battlefield shifted accordingly. If American fighters could reliably intercept Japanese raids 70 to 100 miles out, then the effective strike radius of Japanese aircraft shrank. A bomber that could theoretically travel 300 miles to a target now had to survive a long segment of that distance under attack, burning fuel while maneuvering and defending. Many did not reach the release point with weapons, or at all. American strike aircraft, operating under stronger fighter cover and facing fewer defending fighters, guided by less precise information, enjoyed a greater chance of reaching their targets intact. The cycles of replacement closed the trap. When Japan lost more than 350 aircraft and many experienced pilots over the Marianas in a single day, there was no realistic path to regenerate that force in months, let alone weeks. The training system, already strained, could not accelerate without fuel. The factories, already stretched, could not double output without raw materials and labor that did not exist. For the United States, replacing 100 aircraft and a tranche of pilots, while painful on an individual level, was absorbed by a system designed around high throughput. New airframes moved down assembly lines. New pilots graduated and were assigned to squadrons. The loss of one day's worth of aircraft did not alter long-term capacity. Looked at this way, the Battle of the Philippine Sea was not primarily about individual decisions made on June 19th and 20. It was the visible intersection of curves that had been diverging for years. One nation's industrial and training graphs rising, another's leveling off and then bending downward under strain. Ozawa's courage, Tanaka's skill, the resolve of base commanders on Guam, none of those variables by 1944 could move the larger lines enough. Once Japan committed its remaining carrier air strength into a space controlled by American radar, fighters, and logistics, the outcome followed the arithmetic of fuel, flight hours, tonnage, and factory output. By the time the last aircraft fell into the Philippine Sea, the decisive battle the Japanese Navy had imagined was no longer a question of who would fight harder. It had been decided in machine shops, training fields, and planning rooms, long before the first bogey ever appeared on a green radar screen. In the weeks after the battle, the surface of the Philippine Sea went back to looking like any other stretch of ocean. The wakes faded. The oil slicks broke apart and disappeared. Fish moved through the quiet water where 350 aircraft had fallen. The effects did not fade. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Marianas Turkey Shoot was not just a lost engagement. It was the collapse of the instrument it had built its strategy around. The carriers remained, for a time, long gray hulls with clean lines and well-kept decks, but their air groups were gone. New pilots came aboard in dribbles, younger and less prepared. New aircraft arrived in smaller numbers. None of it added up to the sharp, coherent striking force that had crossed the Pacific in 1941. From that summer on, Japanese carriers sailed more as decoys than as weapons. At Leyte Gulf, they would be sent forward largely empty, a bait fleet meant to draw American strength away from the true attack. It was an admission written in steel. The Navy that had once defined itself by its aviators now used its last carriers as expendable lures. On the American side, the victory opened a corridor that engineers and planners had been drawing for years. With the Marianas secured and the Japanese air arm crippled, runways on Saipan and Tinian extended out toward Japan like concrete fingers. B-29s followed, bringing with them a new kind of destruction that would strip away cities and eventually force the question of surrender in a form no pre-war admiral had imagined. Yet the deeper lesson of the Philippine Sea lies less in the fire than in the structure that produced it. The battle showed, in stark relief, that courage and tradition cannot substitute for a system that has fallen behind. Japan's naval air arm was not defeated because its pilots lacked bravery or skill. It was defeated because the institutions that trained them, fueled them, armed them, and guided them could no longer match those of its opponent. The young men who flew into that sky carried an older belief that will could bend reality. Over the Marianas, reality pushed back. If there is an image to end on, it is not a burning aircraft, but a quiet room. A radar scope dimmed for the night, the grease pencil marks wiped from the plotting table, and a clerk in a distant headquarters putting a final line through a column labeled Carrier Air Strength, knowing that the numbers will never climb back to where they once were.